They found the first man's shoes on the marble lip of the fountain, the leather still polished, the laces tied in perfect bows, as though their owner had simply levitated out of them and kept walking barefoot into the January fog. It was the winter of 1912 in Savannah, when the air carries the smell of river silt and rusted iron, and the live oaks along Bull Street drip Spanish moss like slow, gray tears. No footprints led away from the shoes, only the faint, wet stipple of rain that had begun at dusk and stopped again before anyone noticed the man was gone. His name was recorded in the ledger at the DeSoto Hotel as Mr. Arthur L. Whitcomb, Boston, but the night clerk who checked him in later told the police he could not remember the color of the gentleman's eyes, only that the guest had asked for a room facing the square, not the river, and had paid in brand-new $20 bills that smelled of violet ink. By morning, the shoes were still there, but the city had already begun to forget him. The fountain ran its usual course, pink with camellia petals blown in from the neighboring garden, and the street sweepers joked that another northern husband must have discovered the cost of a southern divorce. Yet something in the way the leather curled, as if still warmed by living flesh, made the chambermaid cross herself when she passed. She would not be the last woman in Savannah to whisper that the city had begun to swallow men whole, only the first to notice it had started with their shoes. I grew up 300 miles inland in the Piedmont clay where nothing disappears. Rusted plows and shattered headstones work their way back to the surface every spring like the earth itself is trying to cough up memory. My grandmother kept a scrapbook of clippings she refused to explain, and on the nights my parents thought I was asleep, I would sneak down the stairs, trace the brittle newsprint with a flashlight, and feel the words settle under my skin like slivers of ice. One headline still scrapes the inside of my skull whenever rain taps my bedroom window. Prominent banker vanishes from ladies' tea. Police suspect no foul play. The article was dated February 1913, exactly 1 year and 1 month after the shoes in the fountain, and the banker, Mr. Alden C. Pierce, had last been seen entering the orange brick townhouse at 32 Abercorn Street, a residence identified only as the headquarters of the Benevolent Society of the Azalea Circle. No one ever explained what a banker from Philadelphia was doing at a ladies' benevolent society, nor why the society itself left no charter, no tax records, no minutes, only that same address repeated again and again in the margins of old city maps, written in lavender ink that never quite faded. By the time I was 12, I had memorized every name in those clippings: Whitcomb, Pierce, DuPont, Holcomb, Farnsworth, men from Richmond, Chicago, New York, all visiting Savannah for reasons that sounded innocuous until you realized each trip ended the same way: an empty hotel room, a hat on a bench, a gold watch ticking beneath an azalea bush, and a police report that read like a lullaby. No signs of struggle, no motive, no body. I told myself it was only the past, that cities change the way people change, that Savannah had outgrown whatever hunger once moved behind its wrought iron gates. Then last year, my husband left for a history conference in that city and never came back, and the officer who took my statement used the exact phrase I had read 100 times in my childhood scrapbook. "We're treating this as a voluntary disappearance." He handed me a manila envelope containing the contents of the hotel safe, Matthew's wallet, his grandfather's pocket watch, and a violet-scented calling card engraved with an address, 32 Abercorn Street, and a single line in cursive I can still taste when I close my mouth: "The circle remembers its own." I have not heard my husband's voice since, but every night at 3:07 a.m., the pocket watch begins to tick in a rhythm that does not match my kitchen clock, and I know, deep in the hollow where reason once lived, that the society is still accepting new members, and that the dues are paid in men. So tonight I am writing this down the way you press a flower in a book to prove it once existed, even as it crumbles. If you are listening, if the dark in your room feels suddenly heavier, ask yourself how many places you can name where history keeps its sharpest teeth politely hidden behind lace curtains. Ask yourself why every southern town has a street named after a woman no textbook remembers. Then ask why when you walk those streets at dusk, the air smells of violet ink and the fountains run pink. Savannah, 1912. The winter had been mild enough that the azaleas bloomed early, lying in pink drifts against the iron fences like the petticoats of ghosts who had grown tired of pretending. Street lamps were still gas then. Their flames hissed in the salt wind, casting halos that made every passerby look headless for the instant it took to step from light into shadow. Horse-drawn drays clopped over cobblestones, but after midnight the sound changed, hooves muffled as if the city itself began wearing stockings, and that was when women in dove-gray cloaks emerged from the side doors of houses that claimed, on brass plaques, to be seamstress academies or charitable guilds for war widows. No seamstress ever carried a lantern that color, a bruised violet glow that left no reflection in window glass. I know this because I have seen the lantern in my dreams since I was 8, the same way I have seen the face of my husband leaning over me the moment before I wake, his mouth forming words I cannot hear because the tick of the watch drowns them. My grandmother told me once that Savannah was built on the bones of a hospital for women who bled from places maps refused to name, and that the soil remembers. She said it while slicing apples so thin you could read newsprint through them, her voice as calm as weather. And I laughed because children laugh when adults hand them something sharp and say, "Careful." She died the week I turned 18, took her last breath at 3:07 a.m., the same minute the watch now chooses to speak. And when we came back from the funeral, the scrapbook was gone, only the faint odor of violets left in the drawer to prove it had ever existed. I have spent every year since trying to convince myself that cities do not conspire, that buildings do not keep appetites, that societies of women do not gather under moonlight to reclaim what centuries of men have taken. Then the shoes appeared in the fountain and the laughter dried in my throat like glue. The Benevolent Society of the Azalea Circle was first mentioned, briefly, politely, in the Savannah Morning News of April 1898, sandwiched between an advertisement for Coca-Cola syrup and a sermon on the evils of bare ankles. The notice thanked the ladies of the Circle for donating hand-tatted lace to raise funds for Confederate widows and gave 32 Abercorn as the address for further contributions. No names were signed. By 1902, the same paper carried a small agate-type item noting that the society had been incorporated under the laws of the state of Georgia for literary and charitable purposes. Yet no charter number followed, and the incorporation page is missing from every archive I have searched, digital, microfilm, or bound in leather the color of dried blood. The city directory for 1904 lists the occupant of 32 Abercorn as Miss Honora M. Saltonstall, Seminary for Young Ladies, but no student roll, no graduation pamphlet, no record of tuition paid. In 1908, the entry changes to Azalea Circle headquarters, and by 1910, the address has vanished entirely, becoming a blank space between 30 and 34 as though the building itself had learned to inhale whenever someone looked too closely. Tax rolls tell a different story. The property never changed hands after 1876 when it was deeded by the estate of Dr. Lionel Saltonstall, Honora's father, whose obituary lists him as a pioneer in the surgical relief of female hysteria. A polite way, I suppose, of saying he specialized in putting into women to make them quieter. His instruments were auctioned the same week the deed transferred, and the inventory survives. Silver-handled scalpels, a set of pewter specula, a violet velvet-lined box containing forceps whose jaws are shaped like azalea petals. The auctioneer noted, in parentheses, "Items may carry slight staining." I have seen the photograph of that box. It was printed in a medical supply catalog that went to press 6 months after the doctor's death, yet the velvet looks already exhausted, as if the metal had been crying into it for years. Honora was 29 when her father died, unmarried, described by a cousin's diary as too clever for her own sex and too severe for ours. She traveled for a time, Philadelphia, Vienna, Marrakesh, sending home trunks that customs agents refused to open after the first officer who tried was found sitting on the wharf at dawn, barefoot, unable to recall his own name. The trunks were delivered to 32 Abercorn under seal of diplomatic immunity arranged by a senator whose wife summered in Newport and kept her silence, the way some women keep pearls, close to the throat, where the pulse can be felt. Honora returned to Savannah in 1995, the same year the city's most prominent obstetrician, Dr. Ambrose T. Pinckney, published a monograph arguing that certain women possessed a congenital darkness of the blood, which made them unfit for civic conversation and dangerous to men of fragile constitution. The monograph sold out in 2 days. Every copy was purchased by an anonymous buyer who paid in violet ink. 3 weeks later, Dr. Pinckney attended a reception at the Saltonstall townhouse. He was seen entering, hat in hand, smiling at something whispered by a woman in gray. He never emerged. His wife told police he had mentioned an urgent consulting trip to Charleston, but his luggage remained at home and his gold watch, an heirloom from his father, was later found beneath the azalea bushes in Monterey Square, still ticking, stopped at 3:07 a.m. The case file labels him voluntarily missing, and the newspaper devoted 5 lines to his disappearance on page 8, between a recipe for persimmon pudding and a notice that young ladies should avoid bicycle seats wider than their own hips. After that, invitations began to arrive. Thick cream cards, handwritten in ink that dried the color of bruises, addressed to men whose wives or sisters or mothers had recently died in childbirth, or in asylums or in bedrooms where the shutters were kept closed because the light made their skin look too much like parchment. The invitations requested the pleasure of their company at an evening of literary recitation and charitable planning, and gave the same address, 32 Abercorn. Men who attended spoke afterwards of lemonade sharp enough to make the tongue bleed, of chairs arranged in a circle so perfect it seemed carved rather than built, of a hostess who never raised her voice yet could silence a room by lifting one eyebrow as if it were a scalpel. They spoke of these things only once. Memory, like flesh, can be sutured. Within a month, each of them left on business trips from which they never returned, leaving behind hats, canes, wallets, wedding rings, always something intimate, never the same object twice, placed neatly in public view as though the city itself was returning their deposits. By 1912, the pattern was refined. The object appeared first, the disappearance second, the forgetting third. Savannah learned to look away the way you learn to breathe without noticing. Men became cautious the way you become cautious of swamps at dusk, less afraid of what you see than of what decides not to show itself. Arthur Whitcomb was simply the first northerner arrogant enough to believe geography could protect him. He checked into the DeSoto on January 9th, asked the bellboy to send up the latest editions of the Morning News and the Boston Globe, and spent the afternoon walking the squares with the confident stride of someone cataloging beauty for future purchase. Witnesses later described him standing at the gate of 32 Abercorn for nearly 10 minutes, reading the brass plaque that now read, "Private Benevolent Society, Members by Invitation Only," tilting his head as if the letters were in a code he could crack by listening. A woman in gray opened the door before he knocked. The only observer, a lamplighter on his rounds, said she moved like fog deciding to have bones, and that Mr. Whitcomb stepped inside without hesitation, the way a man steps into warm water when he believes the bath has been drawn for him. The lamplighter mentioned this to his wife, who told him to hold his tongue unless he wanted to find himself waking up barefoot on the wharf some morning, and the story might have ended there except that Arthur's shoes appeared the next dawn, placed side by side on the rim of the fountain in Lafayette Square, socks folded neatly inside them like a gift no one had asked to receive. The leather was still warm. A stray dog licked the soles and ran away yelping, as if it had tasted salt and something sharper, perhaps the residue of lemonade. Police combed the hotels, the train depot, the steamship wharf. They sent telegrams north to Boston banks where Arthur held accounts to a fiancée who answered that he had spoken of Savannah as a city so polite it apologizes for keeping you alive. The fiancée arrived 2 weeks later, pale beneath her mourning veil, and walked the squares until her heels bled into the cobblestones. She said she heard his voice calling from beneath the manholes, but the city told her the sewer ran only one way, toward the river, toward the ocean, toward forgetting. She left on the afternoon train, veil pressed against the glass like a second, thinner skin, and within a month her letters to the police grew so faint they might have been written in steam. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Obadiah W. Parcells, whose own wife had died in childbirth the previous year, filed the final report from his desk at the precinct, then walked home by a route that took him past 32 Abercorn. He was seen standing at the gate, hat in hand, speaking to a woman whose face was obscured by the porch shadow. That night he told his housekeeper he felt unburdened for the first time in years, and by dawn he had vanished, leaving his badge on the kitchen table and his boots outside the pantry door, laces tied in perfect bows. The city council voted to remove the fountain where the shoes had been found. They replaced it with a bronze statue of a Confederate soldier, whose eyes point steadfastly north, as if to say that all invasions come from that direction eventually. The shoes themselves were placed in an evidence crate, mislabeled, and eventually sold at police auction to a junk dealer who claimed his wife wore them for garden parties until the leather grew thin enough to read newspaper through. She died the following spring, childless, whispering that azaleas had begun to bloom inside her lungs. By 1913, the disappearances were discussed only in the way people discuss tides, acknowledged, blamed on the moon, never investigated. Alden Pierce, the Philadelphia banker, arrived on February 2nd, checked into the Marshall House, and told the clerk he intended to invest in phosphate mining along the Ogeechee River. He attended church on Sunday, tipped the pastor $5, and took communion with tears in his eyes, an act the usher later described as unseemly for a man in a new suit. Monday morning, he received a violet envelope delivered by a messenger who left no name. By Monday evening, he was gone, his gold watch ticking beneath the azaleas in Monterey Square, stopped at 3:07 a.m. The paper devoted 3 lines to his absence, noting that Northern capital was notoriously fickle and that Savannah ladies had long since learned to survive on grace and persistence. What the paper did not note was that every member of the Benevolent Society had been seen wearing a new piece of jewelry the following week. Brooches shaped like open mouths, rings set with stones the color of dried blood, bracelets whose clasps clicked shut with the sound of scissors snapping. Nor did it mention that the azaleas in every square bloomed a deeper shade that spring, so dark they looked almost black in moonlight, or that the scent they released was sharp enough to make pregnant women miscarry simply by walking past. The city kept its secrets the way a well-bred woman keeps her corset laces hidden, tight enough to bruise, silent enough to allow breathing only when absolutely necessary. I did not know when I married Matthew that his dissertation research focused on Shuzong di Nanxing in post-Reconstruction southern cities, an academic phrase for what I had always called the hunger. He laughed when I told him about the scrapbook, about the violet ink, about the minute hand that stops at 3:07. He kissed my forehead and said, "Patterns are only patterns until someone maps them, and that mapping dissolves fear the way sunlight dissolves fog." He left for Savannah on a Tuesday in October carrying a recorder and a list of questions for the archivist at the Georgia Historical Society. His last text message, yes, I still read it every night, said, "Found a sealed envelope addressed to you, violet sealing wax, inside a 1913 police file. We'll bring it home tomorrow. Try not to haunt the apartment while I'm gone." He never sent another. The hotel manager claimed Matthew checked out at dawn, left his key on the counter, walked away barefoot. The security camera shows only static for the 23 minutes around 3:07 a.m. When I arrived the next day, the manager handed me the manila envelope, the watch, the wallet, and asked if I wanted to press charges against the city for existing. I stood in Lafayette Square where the fountain used to be, and smelled azaleas blooming out of season. The bronze soldier stared north, but his shadow pointed south, toward the river, toward the ocean, toward 32 Abercorn. I rang the bell at that address at dusk. The woman who answered wore gray, her hair parted so severely it seemed to bleed where the comb had sliced the scalp. She asked if I had come to claim what belonged to me, and when I said yes, she smiled with only the lower half of her face, the way a wound smiles before it decides whether to heal or to kill. Inside, the foyer smelled of lemonade and lye. The wallpaper was patterned with tiny azaleas, so dark they looked like mouths closed upon secrets. She led me to a parlor where chairs formed a circle perfect enough to make geometry weep, and on each seat lay a single object, a baby shoe, a wedding ring, a fountain pen leaking violet ink, a gold watch ticking toward 3:07. In the center of the circle stood a pair of shoes I recognized, Matthew's, the soles still red from Georgia clay, the laces tied and bows so precise they seemed carved. The woman told me to sit, and when I refused, she tilted her head the way a scalpel tilts before deciding where to enter. She said every city has a stomach, and that Savannah had simply learned to chew with its mouth closed. She said men disappear all the time, but women disappear into themselves, and that the circle had found a way to reverse the transaction. She spoke softly, the way you speak when the walls themselves are listening for an excuse to scream, and when I asked what they wanted, she answered, "Only what has always been owed, interest on centuries of silence." Then she offered me lemonade so sharp I felt my tongue begin to split, and I understood that the only way to leave that house was to leave something behind. I ran, barefoot, because my shoes stayed in the circle, placed neatly beneath the chair as if I had merely paused to remember how breathing worked. I ran until the gas lamps turned to electric, until the azaleas thinned into crepe myrtle, until the river smell replaced the scent of violet ink. But when I reached the hotel, my key no longer fit the lock. The desk clerk looked through me as if I were glass, and the watch in my pocket ticks now in a rhythm that does not match any earthly clock. I boarded the northbound train at dawn. The conductor scanned my ticket, then my face, then asked whether I had enjoyed my stay in the city of second deaths. I did not answer. I could not remember how.
Behind me, Savannah receded like a bruise that has decided to become a scar. But in the window reflection, I saw the woman in gray standing on the platform, holding a pair of shoes against her chest, the way a mother holds a child who will never learn to walk. The train lurched, and the reflection dissolved, yet the image remains, burned into the underside of my eyelids. Every time I blink, I tell myself I escaped. I tell myself I am writing this in my own apartment, on my own laptop, with the door locked and the lights on. But the violet sealing wax lies unbroken on the table beside me, and I cannot remember the walk home from Penn Station, cannot remember paying the cab, cannot remember anything after the conductor whispered, "We all leave something behind. The trick is pretending it wasn't the essential part." The watch reads 3:07, though the clock on the wall says midnight, and when I hold it to my ear, I hear not ticking, but breathing, shallow, familiar, calling my name the way a husband calls from the bottom of a well that has just learned to speak.